So it is my contention, it is my belief that equality is destroying our country. The whole notion of equality is destroying us. Yes, we are equal in love, but we are not equal in the way. Sorry, we're not equal in love. We're equal in value, but not equal in love. So what that means is that, why do I keep looking this way? Does that indicate that I'm lying? Am I going into my memory database? Am I accessing truth? Or am I just lying to my face? I don't know. Anyway, um, so I work in a prison, and there's this one guy that I have problems with constantly, and I target him a little bit because he keeps on undermining my authority and making things hard for me and the unit that I manage. And so I'm targeting him. And it's funny. One time he said like, "Are you targeting me? Are you targeting me?" And like, basically, yeah, I am, but not in the way that he thinks. And he thought I was doing it because of his race, but it's because of his attitude and behavior. And it made me think about like how this all works because like if someone shows bad behavior and you have to respond to that, they can make a case that, like he was saying, he's being targeted. And it's true. It's very true that he is. I am targeting him, but not because of his skin color or because of some other issue. Um, it's because he's causing problems. And the other thing is that we have this system where everyone gets, you know, something. Everyone gets food. Everyone gets healthcare access in the prison. Everyone gets, clothes. Everyone gets this. Everyone gets that, because we're all equal and we should all be treated equally and fairly, supposedly. But that's not true. That's not how life works. Life does not work like that. People who end up having more are going to be the people that either are manipulating the system or they're actually creating value and they're being rewarded for creating the value. So, you shouldn't get just because you are. You should get based on how you use your will. Does that make sense? Like, you know, if I spend 40 to 50 hours a week creating products for people to use, if I have a, you know, lawn factory, and I create lawn tools, I create rakes and, little scissors and shovels and hoes and plows, for people to manage their lawn and garden. I'm creating value. If I spend 10 hours a week working, let's say I work for like a financial company and I just do finance. Um, you're not creating much value if you work in finance. Sorry, if you work in finance, if you manage stocks and you invest and trade or whatever, you're not creating value. And there's a lot of terms that are there to support the idea that this is all, okay and right and capitalistic and stuff. But it ain't, in my opinion. And I don't know how to properly argue against people that believe that investing is good, but there's just something wrong with it that I would say I'm accessing my gut to believe to argue against. So yeah, just investing in general is wrong. But if you work 10 hours in stocks, in some kind of finance, and the rest of the time you don't do much of anything at all, you just use your wealth, then you're not creating value, and you might be manipulating the system. Or if you're like a welfare, recipient, and you don't work at all, and you're sitting in front of the TV all day, you're not creating value doing that. you're not watching kids, you're not taking care of people, you're not doing nothing, then you're not creating value. And you shouldn't be getting the resources that you're getting. Even if you're on welfare, even if you're sick, there ought to be a way for you to work. There ought to be a way for you to create value in the world. There are ways. And in my opinion, you know, we could have like job counselors that help people find those ways in which they can work. Just because you can't walk doesn't mean you can't work, right? Just because you have some kind of illness doesn't mean you can't work. You might have some kind of illness and handicap that keeps you from performing certain tasks, but not all the tasks. And so, you know, it's important that you still use your will. I've dealt with many people that have handicaps. I've driven them to work, to doctors, to shopping, and they are very able people that can do a lot of things. There was a lady that I knew that worked in an office, and she worked 40 hours a week. She worked hard, and she was in a wheelchair. She was immobile in that way. But in other ways, she could use her hands, she could use her mouth, she could use, she could speak, she could organize things, she could use a computer. So, she's a very able person. And that's the universe that God designed. If you're working, if you're creating value, then you ought to be rewarded for the value that you create. But in a prison environment, we just give people things and they don't necessarily have to work. Like a ninth of the prison, there are 9 units in my prison, and one of the units is for workers, and the rest don't have to work. Well, you ought to work. You ought to do some level of work. And I know that they say, well, these prisoners, they get paid so little, and that's ripping them off. That's slave labor. There's maybe some argument to that, but at the same time, they ought to be working because they're kind of paying a debt to society. And the money that we spend to keep them in the prison and keep them healthy and care for their welfare is ought to be recompensed to society. So there's that to be taken into account. I've heard AJ, the man who claims to be Jesus, say that you kind of and don't quote me on this. Like I'm quoting him, but it's more of a paraphrase. But I heard him say something to the effect that you put them in a fenced-in area, and you give them posts, like wooden posts, and maybe some seeds, some basic equipment to begin with, and they have to create their own shelter. They have to create their own water retention sources. They have to create their own food. Through that. So they have like the earth, and they have the weather and the rain and the sun, and they have all these tools to help them to create a livelihood for themselves. So you're not really giving them very much at all, and they have to create the lifestyle that allows them to live and have a good lifestyle. But what we have right now is you give people everything that they need because you better be equal, because you don't want to be, play favorites. But what we're ending up doing is we're giving too much, and people are not being able to use their will, and they're not getting the proper consequences for their bad actions and the proper positive consequences for their good actions, which is what you would normally have in God's system. So prison doesn't simulate life the way it ought to, and it's really awful that we care so much about equality, and we don't care enough about supporting the individual to learn the lessons that God would have them learn. I hope that makes sense. Something that I see is a big problem in prison as a detention officer, and so just wanted to talk about that. Thanks for watching.